Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010, and this is the video on David Hume's essay, An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. So this is the third fundamental question, what can I know? And David Hume is going to say, you can know a lot less than rationalists like Plato or Descartes say you can know. So Hume is an empiricist. George Berkeley, we just read before, is also an empiricist. And an empiricist, as we've been saying, is someone who thinks knowledge comes from the sense organs, the 5 sense organs. Your skin is one sense organ with which you touch. Seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, these are the 5 senses. So empiricists say that's where knowledge comes from. There are no eternal absolute ideas imprinted on the soul, like Plato said, and like Descartes inherited that opinion with some variation. But there is no, for Hume, there's no evidence that there's a soul, and certainly not that there's absolute ideas imprinted on a soul, and that if we can somehow turn the eye of the soul inward and perceive all of these absolute ideas, which are consolidated in the idea of the good, according to Plato's cave allegory, then we would know all universal knowledge. Hume is saying that is not likely to be the case, although Hume says maybe I'm wrong and maybe I can be corrected, and I'm open to it, but at the very least, I want to humble human hubris that thinks that we've discovered the ideas of the mind of God, because Isaac Newton discovered mathematical laws that seem to describe nature. So Hume would recognize that Newton, he doesn't mention Newton specifically in this essay, but he was responding to the euphoria that came along in the Age of Enlightenment when Newton discovered the law of gravity, with which people could predict with great precision all kinds of things like the trajectory of a cannonball. Precisely why would this amount of force cause that cannonball to create this arc and landing precisely there? It's important to know that for warfare and for civilization building, and all the mechanics of architecture. It seemed that Newton had finally once and for all uncovered the ideas of God in his own mind, like Plato said could be done. And Hume was saying, no, that's not what has happened here. Sure, the laws of nature as described by humans are very useful for us. They're very practical, and we should guide ourselves by them. But if we want to be a real philosopher and take curiosity to its extreme, let's really look at what we know and how we know. So that's the fundamental question. And he's going to say, because we can only know things about the natural world around us through our sense perceptions, ultimately he'll say, I have no sense perception of a chain of cause and effect between certain events that happen. I drop a pen, it falls. Oh, the law of gravity. Newton's law of gravity could describe exactly how long it would take to fall from my hand to the book. But what Hume is going to say is, yeah, that's great, but I can imagine me letting go of this pen, and instead of falling down, it floats right in front of me, or it shoots up into the air. That it's not an absolute universal truth that whenever I drop this pen or any other object, it must necessarily fall to the ground. It's not a law of nature. It's just the way things have been perceived in the past, and you assume that they're going to continue that way in the future, and based on that assumption, people are claiming we have eternal truths, or these absolute ideas. We've uncovered them. And he'll say, no, you've uncovered a pattern of the way things have worked in the past. That's all you've got. It's a lot, but it's not absolute ideas imprinted on a soul. And as we saw from the previous reading from Hume, Hume didn't believe in a soul because he's an empiricist and there's no empirical observations of a soul. or a self. So let me get into some of the details of his argument. And I'll keep in mind discussion question 1. And you know what? My page number has been ripped off for that page. So 317 was the last page of Hume's reading. So explain Hume's billiard ball example. That's the first discussion question. So I'll start at the beginning of the reading, and then I'll stop when we get to the billiard ball example. So on page 309, this is from an Enquiry concerning human understanding, section 4, skeptical doubts concerning the operations of the understanding, part 1. All the objects of human reason or inquiry may naturally be divided into 2 kinds, to wit, relations of ideas and matters of fact. So there's 2 types of knowledge that you can have, relations of ideas and matters of fact. He'll explain what those are now. Of the first kind are the sciences of geometry, algebra, and arithmetic, and in short, every affirmation which is either intuitively or demonstratively certain. So, and his example is that the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the square of the 2 sides is a proposition which expresses a relation between these figures. It'll always be true. So if you have a 90, a right triangle, 90-degree angle, then according to the Pythagorean theorem, the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the square of the 2 sides. So if a squared equals b squared plus c squared, the hypotenuse is equal, if you square that number, it's equal to this and that number squared. Square that number, add them together, it equals that number squared. So that is always true. It will never be false. It's impossible to imagine that being false. Once you've understood it, you can't even imagine it not. You can pretend that you do, but you wouldn't understand any way for that not to be the case. It would be impossible for you to imagine 2 plus 2 not equaling 4. You can pretend you can, and through non-Euclidean geometry you could explain it, but just in the most simple terms of 2 objects combined with 2 more objects, you have 4 objects. That's a mathematical, it doesn't, the numbers you apply to objects, this is one object, it doesn't affect this object itself. But your understanding of the relation between this, if I want to call this one pen, this another, and this another, that's 3 pens. That's just a way for me to relate these unrelated things together in my mind. And humans can do that, and it helps us advance in life. It's very necessary for the progress of human civilization to have these relations of ideas in our mind. But what Hume is saying is they do not necessarily relate to the actual physical, empirically observable things. The relationships between these things don't exist. They're discrete, unconnected objects. Any relationship that I want to apply to these things in my mind, it's strictly in my mind that's happening. So it seems it is complicated what he's trying to get at, but I told you at the beginning what his point is. He's trying to refute ideal or rationalism, the belief in these absolute universal laws of nature that the human mind somehow has access to. That's what Plato said, and he's rejecting that. All right, so relations of ideas, those are things like mathematical truths, things you cannot even imagine being the opposite. He said, propositions of this kind are discoverable by the mere operation of thought without dependence on what is anywhere existent in the universe. Though there never were a circle or a triangle in nature, the truths demonstrated by Euclid would forever retain their certainty and evidence. So there is no perfect, mathematically perfect. I'm thinking maybe there is, like a black hole is a singularity is a mathematically perfect point, or a spinning black hole is a mathematically perfect circle. So there are perfect circles in nature, but Hume is saying even if there weren't, still the laws of Euclidean geometry would always hold true. Why? Because they were created by humans. They're arbitrary inventions. And when you create a fiction, that fiction becomes, it's independent of nature. Nature can do what it wants. The world of your own imagination has its own rules, and they'll always stay the same. Matters of fact, actual concrete objects that you see in the world around you, they are not bound by these relations of ideas. We think they are, but they're not. So let's go on here on page 310. He says, matters of fact, which are the second objects of human reason, are not ascertained in the same manner, nor is our evidence for their truth, however great, of a like nature with the foregoing. The contrary of every matter of fact is still possible, because it can never imply a contradiction, and is conceived by the mind with the same facility and distinctness as if ever so conformable to reality. And here's his example. That the sun will not rise tomorrow is no less intelligible a proposition, and implies no more contradiction than the affirmation that it will rise. We should in vain therefore attempt to demonstrate its falsehood. Were it demonstratively false, it would imply a contradiction, and could never be distinctly conceived by the mind. So that's an important point of his reasoning. These relations of ideas are always necessarily true everywhere. You take a human mind in the universe, anytime they think about Euclidean geometry, those laws will always hold. You can't even distinctly conceive of 2 plus 2 not equaling 4, or the hypotenuse of a right triangle not equaling, the square of the hypotenuse of a right triangle not equaling the adding up the squares of the two legs. He's saying you can't even imagine that not being the case once you've understood it. But for matters of fact, you can imagine the opposite of any matter of fact. I can, it's not hard for me to imagine me dropping this mouse and it's going to go straight up. And if I was, although Hume might not have known it at the time, if you go outside of Earth's atmosphere and the gravity is a lot less, then if you let go of it, it would hover right in front of you. Or if you were in an elevator plummeting downward and you dropped an object, it would hover right next to you. If an elevator, if you cut the cable and you just had a free fall and you had something next to you, it wouldn't drop. So there's situations where matters of fact don't work out the way that they normally do on Earth. And even on Earth, he's saying, the law of gravity could stop working tomorrow. There's no guarantee that it must always work in the future. So, continuing on page 310, the last paragraph, he says, all reasonings concerning matter of fact seem to be founded on the relation of cause and effect. By means of that relation alone, we can go beyond the evidence of our memory and senses. So, why, if you put flame under paper, the paper lights on fire. You would assume it's reasonable to say the flame, touching flame to paper causes it to ignite. And David Hume will say, I see people touching flames to paper all the time, and every single time I've ever seen it, the paper ignites, it bursts into flame. But I've never seen anything causing anything else. What is this thing you call causality? Where's the connection between this event happening and that other event happening that you would call cause? I see them physically touching, but that doesn't mean that in the future that must always hold, every time that must always be the case. He said, he'll say, I'll grant you it would be ridiculous to assume that it wouldn't be the case in your daily activities, but as a philosopher, when you're just thinking in the purest way possible and trying to be as strict as you can be with your reasoning, he's saying, as an empiricist, I don't see this causal link. And all of these so-called laws of nature are based on the assumption that these causal links that you think you are perceiving will always hold true forever in the future, everywhere in the universe. And he's saying, I don't see that as something to trust, because he's an empiricist. So here on that bottom paragraph on 310, he gives a couple of examples. Here's one of them. A man finding a watch or any other machine in a desert island would conclude that there had once been men in that island. All our reasonings concerning fact are of the same nature, and here it is constantly supposed that there is a connection between the present fact and that which is inferred from it. Were there nothing to bind them together, the inference would be entirely precarious. The hearing of an articulate voice and rational discourse in the dark assures us of the presence of some person. Why? Because these are the effects of the human make and fabric and closely connected with it. If we anatomize, if we break everything, all of our other reasonings down, if you break them all down, we shall find that they are founded on the relation of cause and effect, and that this relation is either near or remote, direct or collateral. Heat and light are collateral effects of fire, and the one effect may justly be inferred from the other. Okay, but he's saying that this inference doesn't necessarily always hold true. You've discovered a practical law that seems to apply most of the time and probably will continue to apply in the future. But at best, what you have is probable knowledge, highly probable, but not absolute. And therefore, this knowledge is not it's not an absolute idea that you've discovered that's been imprinted on your soul a priori, before sense perceptions, before experience. Okay, so on page 311, and we're getting to this billiard ball example. At the top of page 311, he says, if we would satisfy ourselves, therefore, concerning the nature of that evidence which assures us of matters of fact, which assures us that the way things have happened in the past will continue to happen in the future, we must inquire how we arrive at that knowledge of cause and effect. I shall venture to affirm as a general proposition which admits of no exception, that the knowledge of this relation is not in any instance attained by reasonings a priori, that means before sense perceptions, but arises entirely from experience, when we find that any particular objects are constantly conjoined with each other. So, a priori, before experience. These aren't absolute ideas imprinted on your soul there before you're even born. All knowledge of matters of fact comes from your sense perceptions. Now, I'll mention here, and I'll elaborate later, Plato would agree that knowledge begins with sense perceptions, and that's what Kant will also say in response to Hume. That's Plato's second proof for the soul. Knowledge is recollection. This was on page 38. He said that, for example, when we see two things that are almost perfectly equal, then, oh, wait a minute, that I just had this idea of absolute perfect equality. I've never experienced it anywhere in the empirical world, and yet when I see two things empirically that are approximate perfect equality, it makes me think, oh, they're not perfectly equal. How did I ever even have this standard of measurement of perfect equality? Plato says, you saw some things in the material world that helped you remember these absolute ideas that are imprinted on the soul. His idea that knowledge is recollection does not mean we remember things from our past lives in our material bodies. He's talking about we remember the eternal ideas that you've never experienced in the material world. You only experience them in your own soul, and then you realize those absolute ideas are what is causing all of the material world to exist, in the same way that me holding up my hand in front of the light causes a shadow to be cast on the wall. For Plato, the material world is a shadow. All material objects are shadows of the absolute ideas. Hume is rejecting that, and he's saying, you don't have this knowledge that's innate. And my point is, Plato would say, I agree with you that knowledge of these absolute ideas depends on empirical observations, so that we can then remember these absolute ideas. He's not going to say, oh, you're born, and if you just think hard enough, if you're born and raised in a padded cell with no pictures or anything, I guess you were taught language. It would be hard to have this kind of an experimental arrangement. But what Hume is saying is no human being would ever understand the laws of nature by just analyzing his or her own mind. That the absolute ideas imprinted on the soul, he's saying there is no such thing, and you'd never be able to learn anything by doing that. Plato would agree, yeah, you have to get out, see things, it helps you remember them. So it's a little bit of a straw man that David Hume is attacking when he's attacking rationalists, because rationalists agree, at least Plato did, that you have to have empirical observations to awaken the forgotten knowledge of these absolute forms. But I'll continue here on page 311. The second full paragraph, this proposition that causes and effects are discoverable not by reason but by experience will readily be admitted with regard to such objects as we remember to have once been altogether unknown to us, since we must be conscious of the utter inability, which we then lay under, of foretelling what would arise from them. All right, so let me just skip to the billiard ball example instead of getting into all this. In the middle of the bottom paragraph on page 311, he says, we fancy that we were brought up on a sudden into this world. Okay, we fancy that were we brought up on a sudden into this world, we could at first have inferred that one billiard ball would communicate motion to another upon impulse, and that we needed not to have waited for the event in order to pronounce with certainty concerning it. Such is the influence of custom that where it is strongest, it not only covers our natural ignorance, but even conceals itself and seems not to take place merely because it is found in the highest degree. All right, so this is what I was talking about with his straw man attack on Plato's rationalism. He says, we fancy that were we brought on a sudden into this world, we could at first have inferred that one billiard ball would communicate its motion to another if it hit. Plato would not have inferred that. Plato would say, oh, once you were born and then you saw one billiard ball click into another, that might then spark your memory of the absolute idea of whatever law of nature describes this communication of inertia from one object to another. But it wouldn't have been, if you came suddenly into the world with somehow the ability to think logically, that you just understand everything by consulting your inner spiritual reason. Plato would not say that. I don't know who would. So it confuses me. Hume, who seems to be a very intelligent person, I don't know who he's been talking to who would claim that that would be possible. I mean, even a rationalist would agree with him. You wouldn't be able to know that just by being born suddenly, and that knowledge is not accessible outside of an initial empirical observation. All right, so going on the top of page 312, he says, but to convince us that all the laws of nature and all the operations of bodies without exception are known only by experience, the following reflections may perhaps suffice. Were any object presented to us and we were required to pronounce concerning the effect which will result from it, without consulting past observation, after what manner, I beseech you, must the mind proceed in this operation? So, all right, here's my trusty mouse. He's saying, if you've never seen it before, you don't know what it is, and you're asked just to analyze it and then tell me what kind of effects it can cause, you would say you'd have no idea. It must invent or imagine some event which it ascribes to the object as its effect, and it is plain that this invention must be entirely arbitrary. The mind can never possibly find the effect in the supposed cause by the most accurate scrutiny and examination, for the effect is totally different from the cause, and consequently can never be discovered in it. So he's back to the billiard ball here. Motion in the second billiard ball is a quite distinct event from motion in the first, nor is there anything in the one to suggest the smallest hint of the other. A stone or piece of metal raised into the air and left without any support immediately falls, but to consider the matter a priori, is there anything we discover in this situation which can beget the idea of a downward rather than an upward or any other motion in the stone or metal? So he's going from the billiard ball to another, dropping an event is an example that I used earlier, but I'll continue because he continues the billiard ball example. And as the first imagination or invention of a particular effect in all natural operations is arbitrary, so if you've never been in a world with gravity before, you'd have no idea that things would fall. If someone asked you, you might accidentally guess that it will fall, but it would be arbitrary. And as the first imagination or invention of a particular effect in all natural operations is arbitrary, where we consult not experience, so must we also esteem the supposed tie or connection between the cause and effect which binds them together and renders it impossible that any other effect could result from the operation of that cause. When I see, for instance, a billiard ball moving in a straight line towards another, even suppose motion in the second ball should by accident be suggested to me as the result of their contact or impulse, may I not conceive that 100 different events might as well follow from that cause? May not both these balls remain at absolute rest? May not the first ball return in a straight line or leap off from the second in any line or direction? All these suppositions are consistent and conceivable. Why then should we give the preference to one which is no more consistent or conceivable than the rest? All our reasonings a priori will never be able to show us any foundation for this preference. In a word, then, every effect is a distinct event from its cause. So that's a long example with this billiard ball to try to tell you that the laws of cause and effect, that's what the laws of nature are. They are simply based on what we've experienced in the past through our sense perceptions. We've seen a certain sequence of events continuously occurring. Based on that experience, we assume that there's this relationship that must necessarily continue into the future. He's saying, I don't see the relationship of cause and effect. It's just this habit of perceiving things in that sequence that's making me assume it's going to continue like that in the future. If there is some connection, show it to me. On page 314, about 5 lines down from the top, he says, now this is a process of the mind or thought of which I would willingly know the foundation. It is allowed on all hands that there is no known connection between the sensible qualities of bread he's talking about and the secret powers of its ability to give us nutrition. And consequently that the mind is not led to form such a conclusion concerning their constant and regular conjunction by anything which is known of their nature. As to past experience, it can be allowed to give direct and certain information of those precise objects only in that precise period of time which fell under its cognizance. But why this experience should be extended to future times and to other objects, which for aught we know may only be in appearance similar, this is the main question on which I would insist. The bread which I formerly eat nourished me. That is a body of such sensible quality as well as at that time endued with such secret powers. But does it follow that other bread, eaten at another time and in another place, must have the same ability to give me nourishment? We work on the assumption, he says, that it will, but that's not a rational assumption. That's just an assumption. Well, it's rational, but it's rational based on matters of fact. It's not rational based on relations of ideas. When you reason about relations of ideas, which he said, for example, are mathematical relations between numbers, you can be certain it will always be true in the future. When you reason about matters of fact, the best you can have is probable knowledge, he says over in the first full paragraph of page 315. But before I go there, I want to continue in this big middle paragraph on page 314. So continuing about this example of the bread, just because it looks like bread, there's no guarantee it's always going to give you nourishment. So he continues here, these two propositions are far from being the same. I have found that such an object has always been attended with such an effect, and I foresee that other objects which are in appearance similar will be attended with similar effects. I shall allow, if you please, that the one proposition may justly be inferred from the other. I know, in fact, that it always is inferred, but if you insist that the inference is made by a chain of reasoning, I desire you to produce that reasoning. The connection between these propositions is not intuitive. There's no inner idea imprinted on your soul that you can have this inner intuitive knowledge of, oh yeah, I just know that bread will always give you nourishment because I have the idea of bread imprinted on my soul, and within that idea of bread is included all of the information about all of the particular instances of bread I might ever encounter. David Hume says, okay, show me that idea of bread imprinted on your soul. Show me your soul. I'm an empiricist. If you can't show it to me, it's not real. So continuing here, he says, there is required a medium, meaning a connecting medium, some substance or something connecting these two ideas. There is required a medium which may enable the mind to draw such an inference, if indeed it be drawn by reasoning and argument. What that medium is, I must confess, passes my comprehension, and it is incumbent on those to produce it who assert that it really exists and is the origin of all our conclusions concerning matters of fact. So what is this connecting medium between what we perceive through our senses and the effects that we assume must always come from them? Where is that causal link? What is it? With that, I would say, I'll say it now, and then for discussion question 4, what are the similarities and differences between Hume's skepticism and the skepticism of Chuang Tzu? Well, Chuang Tzu talked about it also. The Katha Upanishad talked about it more explicitly in the readings that we've had. Plato talks about it explicitly in dialogues, not in the readings we had, but in other dialogues. They talk about the outermost sphere of the cosmos, where the past, present, and future are all conserved, and in from which they radiate to create this world around us. They call that the cosmic mind. So Hume is asking for this medium where the connections between objects and between what an object is now and what it will cause to happen in the future. How do I know? Where's this connection? Where's this medium? Well, if what the Hindus say about this outermost cosmos is true, and if what Leonard Susskind says, the string theorist from Stanford University, says is true, then if you could somehow merge your mind with that outermost sphere of the cosmos, which people claim to have done during near-death experiences, then you would see the connection between every point in space and every other point in space throughout all time simultaneously, which is what mystics declare to be the ultimate goal. And that realization of all points of space-time is simultaneous with your realization of the self, that the soul is one with this outermost sphere and the centralmost point from which it radiates. You don't have to know that for this, the upcoming exam, although you could mention this relationship between the Katha Upanishads claim that you can know the past, present, and future, and David Hume's request for a medium that would give you knowledge of these necessary connections that reach into the future. If you knew all of the history and the future of the universe, then you could say, okay, here's the medium, it's the cosmic horizon. Could I show that to you? That would be another story. How could you empirically prove there even is such a thing? Because that's where space is expanding at the speed of light. So I've touched enough on that. I like David Hume because the evidence he demands is very specific, so that if you then find the evidence that he's looking for being at least proclaimed to be the truth in some other texts, then it lends more credence to those other texts. Oh, why do you even mention that in the Taoist text? Why do you mention that the sagely man carries the past and the future under his arm? Why is that important? And then you read David Hume, you say, oh, he doesn't believe in cause and effect. He doesn't believe we can have knowledge of necessary universal truths. He wants to know where this connecting medium is. Well, here's at least someone has an answer. It might not be correct, but it's an answer. And let's see, how would you think about that, David Hume? And David Hume, in this article, he's not entirely arrogant. He's saying, I might be corrected. I don't know. If you look on page 313, he says, the top paragraph, the last 4 lines, the most perfect philosophy of the natural kind only staves off our ignorance a little longer, as perhaps the most perfect philosophy of the moral or metaphysical kind serves only to discover larger portions of it. Thus, the observation of human blindness and weakness is the result of all philosophy, and meets us at every turn, in spite of our endeavors to elude or avoid it. So he's saying, I don't have the answers to the fundamental questions, and I'm claiming that the answers that some have put forward are illegitimate. And I think that You know, what if philosophy gives us nothing else, at least it lets us realize how blind and weak we really are. That is consistent with what Socrates, the ultimate rationalist, at least as depicted by Plato, says. I know that I'm wise because I'm the only one who knows that I'm not wise. Everyone else thinks they have wisdom, and I go about showing everybody that what they thought they knew, they really didn't know. That's really what David Hume is doing here. But Socrates kept reasoning and thought he had come to some good arguments for why we are all eternal souls, and there's one absolute supreme soul or absolute idea of the good. And Hume doesn't go there. He leans towards the other direction, more towards the Buddhist atheistic response. But what can I know is the fundamental question for part 3. And there on page 313, at the bottom of that first paragraph, you'll see he'll say, human blindness and weakness, so we can't know much, but we can at least know what we don't know, and that's what he's trying to do. Let's at least know our own ignorance. What is it that we are ignorant of? Well, we're ignorant of why we believe in cause and effect. And if you look on page 316, that whole point about show me the foundation for these causal relations, at the top of 316, he says, the question still recurs, on what process of argument this inference is founded, this inference of cause and effect. Where is the medium, the interposing ideas which join propositions so very wide of each other? Then down at the bottom of that page, maybe 5 lines from the bottom, he says, as an agent, you know, he's saying, oh, where's the reasoning that tells you if I drop this, it's going to fall? And then someone might say, oh, it's my past experience. I've seen it happen all the time. So then Hume will say, as an agent, I am quite satisfied in the point, but as a philosopher who has some share of curiosity, I will not say skepticism. I think that means I will not put aside my skepticism. I want to learn the foundation of this inference. No reading, no inquiry has yet been able to remove my difficulty or give me satisfaction in a matter of such importance. I can do better than propose the difficulty. Can I do better than propose the difficulty to the public, even though perhaps I have small hopes of obtaining a solution? We shall at least by this means be sensible of our ignorance if we do not augment our knowledge. All right, so let's go back to these discussion questions. It would be, I guess, page 319. We went over the billiard ball example, so discussion question 2. Explain the differences between Hume's empiricism and the kinds found in Locke and Berkeley. So we skipped Locke, so let's just, on this discussion question, if it's on the exam, it'll be just Berkeley. So Berkeley also is an empiricist. What do I perceive? He says, I don't perceive material objects that exist outside of a thinking mind. I'll tell you that much. What do you mean you don't perceive them? He goes, all I perceive are ideas in my mind. Perceptions are ideas in the mind. I see colors. I taste flavors. I hear sounds. I don't see a material object that exists outside of my mind. That's just a manifest contradiction. If I see it, it's in my mind. Oh, say the materialists, well, all right, I grant you that you might only ever see your own sights, your own perceptions, and that you can't get outside of your own head, but doesn't it seem more reasonable to assume that the ideas you have in your mind are copies of, representations of actual material objects that exist outside of your mind? And he says, no, I think that's just adding on an unnecessary step. Well, what about the fact, say the materialists, that I see this mouse and so does anyone else who walks in this room? It's not just an idea, that's a physical thing. Granted, I'm experiencing an idea of it in my mind, but how come that person's experiencing the exact same idea? I'm thinking of a number, that person doesn't know, but yet we both see this. So then Berkeley's response is yes, because this is an idea in God's mind, or what he calls an idea of sense, versus the ideas of our own imagination. And the reason that the laws of nature seem to be these reliable universal forms of knowledge isn't because they're abiding by absolute ideas imprinted on our soul. It's because that's just the way God thinks. That's the way God's always thought in the past. So it's reasonable to assume that God will continue to think in that pattern of And so we can base our predictions on the future on our past observations. But it isn't absolute ideas imprinted on a soul. Berkeley didn't believe in these absolute ideas that Plato talked about. He says there's no absolute idea of mouse, of which all the mice, computer mice in the world are like shadows or projections. This is an idea in God's mind, and any other mouse anyone has is another idea. There's not just one. God has all innumerable ideas in his mind, and that is the so-called material world around us. So, what's the difference between Hume's empiricism and Berkeley's? Well, Berkeley believes in two ingredients of the universe: ideas and the minds that think them. Whereas Hume only believes in ideas. He doesn't believe in minds, which is going to be hard for him to defend that position. He says, well, there is no self. There's no enduring self that continues from one moment to the next. All there are unconnected sense perceptions, but they're occurring so swiftly that it gives the illusion of a continuous stream of consciousness. But really, it's unconnected little atoms of sense perception. And those are ideas. They're not material things. Hume will acknowledge they are sense perceptions, but they're not the sense perceptions of an enduring soul, of a self. They are just sense perceptions. And then you have a thought about it. Well, there is a thought about that sense perception, but there's nothing underlying all those different thoughts connecting them to a self. So a big difference between Berkeley and Hume is Berkeley believes in minds. He believes in a self that continues to exist. Hume does not. On page 302, Berkeley says, up at the top, maybe 4 lines down, he says, but the mind, taking no notice of itself, is deluded to think that it can and does conceive bodies existing unthought of or without the mind, though at the same time they are apprehended by or exist in itself. So the same reasoning can apply to Hume's rejection of the idea of a self. You could say the self, taking no notice of itself, is deluded to think that it can and does conceive sense perceptions existing without a self. I know that was confusing what I just said. Berkeley is trying to show that although you can never have a sense perception of a mind, you can infer that there must be a mind because you have ideas. Hume will say, no, you cannot infer that you have a mind. And yet you do have sense perceptions, so something seems to be thinking. We saw Descartes say, if I think, I must exist. Even if I doubt my thoughts are true, the simple fact that I'm doubting proves that at least I exist. Hume will not grant that with good or bad reasons. That's up to you to think. I do believe in an underlying self, and this whole medium of cause and effect I associate with the cosmic horizon, which the Hindus call the cosmic mind. Plato wrote about it. St. Augustine wrote about it. A lot of different philosophers write about it. But again, you're not going to be held responsible for that knowledge for the exam. So, discussion question 2, explain the differences between Hume's empiricism and Berkeley's. I think that's the main one. Berkeley does believe in a mind and a God whose ideas are our sense objects, and Hume does not. But they both say there are no absolute ideas. All of our knowledge comes from sense perceptions. Okay, so discussion question 3. Which view of knowledge makes more sense to you, the rationalist position or the empiricist position? Why and explain. So we've seen the two rationalists in the stricter sense that we've seen are Plato and Descartes. So you can refer to either one of them or both of them, but the main point that you need to keep in mind is that the rationalists believe that the human mind is pre-programmed with knowledge, these absolute perfect forms of knowledge. And that because we have that knowledge, we're able to understand the laws of nature, the laws that govern nature. We can predict the future about the movements of the material world because we have the same ideas that God had in his mind when he created the material world. All of the ideas, the absolute ideas, are contained in the idea of the good, and the goal of philosophy is to turn the eye of the soul inward to that idea of the good, the center of your soul itself, and that will give you universal knowledge. The empiricist position says there are no absolute perfect ideas of which the material forms are these reflections, and that all of our knowledge of the material world comes entirely from empirical observations. Then we can reason about them and assume things will continue to occur in the same pattern in the future, but we can never be absolutely certain that that must always hold true. Berkeley might say, well, God's mind works in God's eternal, and so the way of his mind won't change. So maybe you can depend on the past sequence of events always recurring in the future, but it won't be because you have any knowledge of any absolute ideas imprinted on your soul. It will simply be because you have faith in the supreme self, and that the world is made of God's ideas. So we live in God's mind, so there's some stability with that. But he'll reject the Platonic idea, which Descartes inherited parts of, that there's a soul imprinted with these absolute forms of knowledge. So which view makes more sense to you? That part of the question is less important than your knowledge of the two positions. So whichever side you come down on, just convey to me that you have knowledge of both sides. And if you can support your answer with short, pertinent quotes, so much the better for your grade. Okay, discussion question 4. What are the similarities and differences between Hume's skepticism and the skepticism of Chuang Tzu? Okay, so they're both skeptical that the human mind is capable of having absolute knowledge. The main difference is Shuang Tzu, and I've said this before, if there's a continuum of philosophy with the Hindus on one side and Plato's closely aligned with them, and the Buddhists on the other, with whom David Hume is closely aligned, then the Taoists would be in the middle, leaning towards the Hindu Platonic belief in God and soul, but saying, we can't be certain. The Hindus say, you can be certain, I'm telling you. I'm Yamaraj, the demigod of death. Vishnu has instructed me, and I'm telling you, take it for certain truth. Plato would say, well, we can't be certain. We should have a hesitating confidence in human reason. On page 65, he says that, but I think we do probably have a soul imprinted with absolute ideas. I think there's enough reason to believe it. So you should believe whatever your reason tells you to believe. So he's not as dogmatic, but for this discussion question, Shuang Tzu seems to be skeptical of the possibility of absolute knowledge about the nature of the self and the universe, but he inclines towards believing that there is a soul and a God. And the similarities are simply that they're skeptical and that they think it's important for humans to be in tune with their own fundamental blindness and weakness. Humbly realize how little we really can be certain of. That's the main similarity between them. Another big difference is Shuang Tzu doesn't put such an emphasis on the need for empirical observation. Hume is a strict empiricist. That's not Shuang Tzu's thing. He's a skeptic. But he's not saying, well, there's only one source of knowledge, and that's empirical sense perceptions. He doesn't say that. And as a matter of fact, whereas Hume very clearly attacks the idea of cause and effect, he's saying it's not a real thing, it's an imaginary relation of ideas that doesn't apply to the material world. Shuang Tzu, along with Plato, does believe in cause and effect, and one of the main forms of causation that he talks about is opposites come from opposites. For him, it was worldviews. One worldview is the same as its opposite, and they create each other. They're two sides of the same coin. Plato, that was his first proof for the soul. Day comes from night, night comes from day, strength from weakness, and weakness from strength. So it's reasonable to assume life comes from death, just like we know death comes from life. So that was one more difference between them. And it's also, it's important to remember in the Chuang Tzu text, it begins with a teacher going into a trance. And so I'll just leave it. Let's see, what was it, page 252 is where, 253 is where it starts. And it starts out with this, you know, a student watching his teacher go into a trance. And then on page 259, the second paragraph, you know what, I'll read bits from this whole page because it shows his skepticism. It was the story of Li Qi, the beautiful woman, but the fish and the deer and the birds are scared of her. Don't they understand what female attraction is? And then he'll go on to say, as I look at the matter, the first principles of benevolence and righteousness and the paths of approval and disapproval are inextricably mixed and confused together. How is it possible that I should know how to discriminate among them? Plato would say, what makes someone beautiful? The idea of beauty. That's the first principle. You can trace any beautiful person or object or idea back to its source in your own soul, the idea of perfect beauty. That's a first principle. Chuang Tzu is saying, how should I know what the absolute standard of beauty really is? All right, so there's skepticism, and that's a lot like David Hume. But in the next paragraph, you know, he has these little dialogues that come in people's names. I don't know who they are, but Wang Ai replied, the perfect man is spirit-like. Great lakes might be boiling about him, and he would not feel their heat. The hole in the Han River might be frozen tip, and he would not feel the cold. Oh, the hole in the Han, maybe they're mountains. At any rate, he won't feel cold. The hurrying thunderbolts might split the mountains, and the wind shake the ocean without being able to make him afraid. Being such, he mounts on the clouds of the air, rides on the sun and moon, and rambles at ease beyond the four seas. And then skipping down a paragraph. How could anyone stand by the side of the sun and moon and hold under his arms all space and time? So he says, such language only means that the sagely man keeps his mouth shut and puts aside questions that are uncertain and dark, making his inferior capacities unite with him in honoring the one Lord. Men in general bustle about and toil. The sagely man seems stupid and to know nothing. He blends 10,000 years together in one conception of time. The myriad things all pursue their spontaneous course, and they are all before him as doing so. So that's related to his idea on page 258 of the heavenly treasure house and the store of light, which I related to the Tao Te Ching, this whole idea of the central point of correspondency, reaching out into outermost space until it reverts to its original point. That was section 25.3 of the Tao Te Ching. Chuang Tzu has the same idea, it seems, of all the past, present, and future being contained at the outermost sphere of the universe. That would be the foundation of the connecting medium for how we could understand cause and effect that Hume was demanding. If you see everything connected to everything else at every point of the outermost sphere, then you would know, upon just looking into your own soul, exactly what is going to happen in any sequence of events. Now that's a mystical kind of a claim that Plato and the Taoists make and the Hindus. It's a, you know, it seems otherworldly, and it doesn't seem that kind of pragmatic empiricism, but it is strangely similar to the most advanced reaches of physics today, holographic string theory, and it does answer Hume's demand for that connecting medium within which to see the causal links between things. Okay, so Chuang Tzu says on page 254, let us stop, and I will now stop. No, I won't. You know why? Because this question's asking for similarities and differences with Hume, and I mentioned this, but I'll just give you this. On the bottom of page 254, If there were not the views of another, I should not have mine. If there were not I with my views, his would be uncalled for. This is nearly a true statement of the case, but we do not know what it is that makes it be so. It might seem as if there would be a true governor, with a capital G, so he's talking about God, concerned in it, but we do not find any trace of his presence and acting, that such a one could act, so I believe, but we do not see his form. He has affections, but he has no form. So, like I said, he's a skeptic, but unlike Hume, he inclines towards the belief in God. He admits, I don't perceive God with any of my senses, but I think that there is a God. But I can't be sure. So we'll leave it at that. And the next video will be on the text by Immanuel Kant. So if you thought David Hume was kind of difficult to understand, I hope I made it a little easier. Well, Kant will be at least as challenging.